Well, hello. It's nice to see so many students here today. And I just want to start by thanking both Johnny Golding and also Daniel for inviting me to participate in this BIAD event, the Verge of Photography. Something I've been thinking about an awful lot recently is something that was said quite recently by a young Austrian artist called Oliver Larich, whose work you may be familiar with. And he makes work both for and about the space of the internet. Some of my favourite works of art, he says, are ones that have only been described to me. And I'm obviously not alone in this. In fact, it's been an overriding preoccupation for artists interested in developments in photography for perhaps 2 decades now. Where actually does the work exist? What or where is its materiality? And it was great yesterday and today to hear some of the speakers talking about these ideas from many different perspectives. Looking at the world of images and of ideas, as Johnny said, as deep and multifaceted fractals rather than fragments, and through to Martin's reminder via Blade Runner that memory and therefore representations of it are constantly renegotiable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. So, as I said, my name's Wendy McMurdo, and I'm an artist who works in photography and film. And in my work, really since the early 90s, I've been particularly interested in looking at the impact of computation, both on photography and on the ways in which we describe and depict ourselves. And here, I'm using the term algorithmic in this paper to describe my own work in an image that has been produced as, with, in, or through software. So what I'm going to do to present this afternoon is a modified version of a presentation that I gave last month at Goldsmiths College at a panel event called Uncanny Visions, some background of which is shown on screen here. And the main topic of discussion at that event is very relevant, I think, for this conference. And then at that event, we were looking at the growing interest of robotics in the arts, and the participants were also asked to consider the role of the Heimlich, or the uncanny, especially in relation to the figure of the robot. There does now seem to be a renewed interest in the Heimlich, and today this reading of the uncanny is linked most often to our experiences, of course, of the internet and new technologies in general, virtual things that still create feelings of strangeness. So what I also want to do here is to look at that idea and to think about how it must surely be to simulation and to the place of the internet that we must now truly look for these potential Heimlich encounters. And somebody who's written about this very interestingly, I think, is Italian curator and writer Domenico Quaranta. I'm sure some of you know his work. He recently put together his Into the Uncanny Valley project, which explores what he describes as a study of objects or images that exceed the limit or go beyond what we find acceptable in culture. And critically, these encounters he collects are often created and then made visible online, as with Oliver Larich's work. So the internet then becomes the repository for these encounters. So what I want to do in these 20 minutes is to show how I've explored, as an artist, ideas relating to the algorithmic and Heimlich through a variety of projects. And I beginning with an early digital project and moving on to a turn of the millennium exhibition also called Unheimlich in Zurich in 1999. And finishing with a series of recent images featuring automaton robots. And I begin with an image from a project of mine made in the mid-90s called In a Shaded Place, the Digital and the Uncanny. And while the idea of the uncanny is, of course, most often attributed to Freud with reference to his 1919 essay, for me as an artist, it is a description of the uncanny given by one R. Gutzow, I think I pronounced that correctly, in conversation with Freud that I find most powerful and most useful to me as a practitioner. What do you mean by Heimlich? Asked Freud to Gutzow. Well, I think both you and I regard it rather like a dried up spring or a dried up pond. You can't walk on it without thinking that water might appear at any moment. Now for me, this is quite a powerful description, and it could also be used to describe the relationship between photography and the so-called algorithmic practice. The algorithmic image being one that straddles the real and the not so real world and becomes evidence of the absolute necessity now, I think, for me, I feel that the necessity now of tessellating between the two. So I first used this term in relation to my own work, and I did so very much in response to the climate of uncertainty in regard to photography's place in the then newly emerging technical universe. And this is the cover from my first digital project, was published in 1995. At that point in time, as the last speaker has really interestingly noted, there's a considerable upheaval for lens-based practice. Photography, long considered a medium with a privileged position as a recorder of the real, if indeed this had ever actually truly been the case, was now looking forward towards an uncertain future, with photography beginning to adopt what I described at that time, writing about this project, as a Janus-like appearance. The introduction of computation as standard into art schools from 1990 onwards both challenged previously held beliefs regarding the photographic image, in other words, that it was singular and unique, and opened up the medium to those more interested in playing with photography's structures rather than its aesthetic or documentary effect. So in this project, I really wanted to trace that move from one medium, from traditional photographic practice, to another, what has now come to be coined as very quickly as algorithmic photography. I'm interested in looking at the exact point that happened as well. So, in that project, I wanted to develop a new body of work which embodied the then influence of computation on identity. It was at that time that, for instance, research was moving quickly towards the production of the first mammalian clone. The internet was growing exponentially, and readily accessible digital methods of production and dissemination for artists were a reality. Whilst the first practically affordable digital camera was some years off, and photo sharing sites, of course, were not yet a reality, the conditions which would allow these things to thrive, however, were being set in place. And I can remember at that time, because I did this work just after I finished my own MA, I know there's some MA postgraduate students in the audience, there was particular kind of reading and text and research that were really important, and one of them was Sandy Stone's early research onto multi-user domains and the development of multi-user domains. I found that very kind of interesting, and thinking about making a project which somehow looked at the ways in which we were going to have to re-describe ourselves and how to image that. Describing this particular project in an interview with Sheila Lawson for Creative Camera in 1995, we talked a little bit about the idea of the Heimlich and the unhomely as it related to photography, and that was a key interest for many theorists and practitioners at that point. But interestingly, I can remember that Freud's text only became important quite a bit after making the work, when I was really trying to understand exactly why the images worked in the way they did. I think that's often the case for artists. I think it's interesting. In the Creative Camera interview, I said, rationally, we know or believe that only one of us can exist. Freud attempts to define the uncanny as arising from a number of fears or anxieties. First, he states that the uncanny is aroused when we have doubts as to whether an apparently inanimate being is still alive. Second, we fear the loss of sight. And thirdly, we harbour a fear of what Freud describes as one of the most prominent themes of uncanniness, and that's the double or the doppelganger. And Lawson went on this interview to reflect that, of course, since modernism, photography has consistently reflected anxieties about individuation and autonomy, especially when technology's evolution changes our concept of the nature of being human, which of course is a rapidly ongoing and moving project at the moment. So that was very much the theoretical context for that work at that time. And this work was all shot up in Sheffield, working with a young drama group, a group of young actors over a period of a year and a half, working with them during improvisory sessions, either staged in church halls or in on stage, theatre stages. So I want to move on now by only a few years and look at another iteration of the uncanny and look how that traced the development of digitality for photography. And this is a cover for an exhibition from 1999, which was curated by Urs Stahl, called Heimlich, for the Photo Museum and Winterthur. And I remember there were quite a few shows and certainly lots of writing and photography which referred specifically to the notion of the uncanny at this point in time. And this interest seemed to reveal itself in various ways, either as preoccupations with the supernatural, for instance. And I remember taking part in an exhibition here actually in Birmingham at the Icon Gallery in 1999 called ESP, where Susan Hiller also showed Psy Girls. And also there was a renewed interest too at that point in spirit photography. In 2005 there was a huge survey show called The Perfect Medium at the Metropolitan Museum. So these interests in the late 90s in photography's ability or inability to conjure up the invisible was registered and acknowledged, I think, the introduction of the new, and at that point largely a knowable space being opened up by computation and algorithmic photography. So shifts in the ontology of the medium brought about by these changes created exactly the uncertain conditions where the Heimlich might truly flourish. So it's no surprise perhaps that artists beginning to reflect on these states in their work at this point. And Stahl's Heimlich was made up of 5 artists, myself, and I showed this series and other pieces which were produced around about that time, looking at the introduction of digital techniques for music and thinking about the implications of that. Dana Hoey's work, and Hoey uses the everyday to create scenarios where the uncanny registers very slowly, as in this picture, where it's only after studying it for a short while that the eye registers in a small visual stain and the fact that something is not quite right. And thinking about the presentation yesterday in regards to sort of Instagram and filters, I really think that's interesting in terms of the speed at which you read, take in and understand an image. And clockwise from top left, Vanessa Beecroft, Natasha Lasser and Anna Gaskell. In his introductory essay to this show, Thin-Skinned and Ambiguous, curator Urs Stahl describes the uncanny as an amorphous concept. Things and experiences, he suggests, are varyingly uncanny to different people at different time. In the work that Stahl selects as suggestive of the contemporary Heimlich for this project, we can see a broad range of interpretations of the theme. From Hoey's slightly off-kilter everyday scenes to Beecroft's actors as robot-like drones, from Lasser's figures halfway between vegetal and human, to Gaskell's play on scale and referencing of Carroll's Alice. And I think it's really useful here to think of the uncanny as something that can as often be linked to the banal or the ordinary rather than the extraordinary. In fact, perhaps the banal and the ordinary are preconditions for its occurrence or appearance, as is clearly suggested, I think, in Hoey's work. And one of the pieces that I showed in Heimlich was this piece called Computer Class. And this was made in 1996, and this work documented the introduction of the first BBC microcomputers into primary schools. And while the ostensible subject of these pieces was the computer, of course, which is missing, in the background of the computer class images, you can also see that the children at this point were surrounded by traditional toys. And it was very interesting because I remember shooting this work in this school and then going back a few years later to make a documentary actually in the same school. And this classroom had completely been emptied and was being replaced by IT suites. So in the arc of those 5 years, everything had completely changed. And I'm still very interested in sort of documenting that trajectory and the way that the use of technologies really does sort of affect, especially children and learning. So that's an ongoing project. So I don't think it could have been foreseen, even at this stage in the mid-90s, quite how quickly computation would come to dominate play, even for children as young as those pictured here, and these children are 5 and 6. And while today simulation is second nature for children of this age, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of that wonderful clip of Martin's daughter Maya that he showed yesterday, then that door was just opening, and these beginnings were something that I very much wanted to explore in this work, because these children, after all, were the first to evolve what we now describe as digital natives. But to go back to this notion of the uncanny, one of the themes of Freud's original essay that had especially interested me in relation to the earlier themes thrown up by Initiated Place was his analysis of the importance of movement or lack of movement in both the photograph and the subject, and this was somehow key to the functioning and the understanding of the uncanny. Animation meant life, and in its absence there would always be room for doubt. This is a piece shot in a room in a Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh that showcases nothing but mountains of dolls and successions of glass-fronted cases. Quite a creepy place, really. Clearly, as children, we freely animate the inanimate. In childhood, simply by making our toys or the objects of our desires move to feed our imaginations as we move from one stage of development to the other. Very important thing. With traditional objects such as dolls, even those which have pre-recorded voices and robotic movement, we project ourselves onto the objects. With a new generation of digital toys, however, our toys talk back to us, both demanding answers and setting the scene. And I found that it was through the doll or the toy or the plaything that I first really became interested in what I'm going to move on to now, the last stage of the presentation, which is the figure of the robot. In the previous image, a preschool child expresses an ambivalence to the object. Is it alive or is it not? And that feeling has become very familiar to me a few years earlier when I was photographing children looking at taxidermy. And in this piece, Girl with Bears, one of a series shot in Victorian museums, I was particularly interested in looking at that feeling invoked where movement was suggested but not present. And this is Japanese engineer Masahiro Mori's much cited Uncanny Valley graph from 1970. And here we can see where the inanimate doll and taxidermy will be placed on Mori's curve. So taxidermy, being static in nature, is placed on the still curve as fairly unthreatening. As objects begin to move, however, they obviously move dramatically up the curve. Let's see if I can move this one for you. All right, I don't know if I can get this to play. No. Sorry, but this is you get the kind of idea. And when you get to objects such as this one, which is a robotic head developed by Bristol Robotics Lab, objects begin to assume an uncanny aspect registered as extremely high in Mori's curve. So links between the figure of the automaton and of the doll and the toy are clear, and this head, used as a research tool by BRL to look at the potential of developing empathy in humanoids, or rather mimicking empathy, this object was obviously very at the extreme range of the spectrum. But usually, of course, our relationship to electronic or virtual others is a much more subtle and complex thing. And I remember my own oldest child, when she was about 6 or 7, playing with early digital toys and hearing her talk to me or to others about characters she'd encountered there as if they were 100% real, as indeed they seemed to her. And her relationship with the computer was obviously destined to be very different to my own. And I think that there's quite a few stories like that. I mean, I think this clip of Maya sort of reminded me of that, and also reminded me of another story that I heard Grayson Perry talk about his daughter. He was taking his daughter when she was quite young to the park, and she saw a swan, and she went, "Swan, pretty." And she reached out to, and I think that you see these kind of sort of gestures sort of replayed over and over. But at that point, I was sort of interested in sort of trying to sort of look at that and think about that. And again, Sherry Turkle noted in her book Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. Network digital play obviously gives us the opportunity to play with, but apart from others. Essentially, I think, therefore, linking the concept of the uncanny directly to the digital space. If the uncanny could be described as the conjuring up of something that is both strange and unfamiliar, then surely beginning to play with someone you've never met for the first time must qualify as truly in Heimlich. This idea is something that I've worked with, as I said, in a series of pieces which documented the then introduction of handheld network gaming devices to the playground and beyond. This is a piece from that series called Games Hall. So I've only got another few minutes, and for the last section of the presentation, I want to follow these ideas through and show a short series of images of automata and robots. And this project was sparked by several things, and one of them being a fascination with this object, which is currently on display at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. Made from the crudest elements necessary to give the impression of a face, Freddy was a precursor to the industrial robots on which the car industry was later forged and was developed in the late 60s and early 70s by Scottish roboticist Donald Meeke. And later Meeke became very interested in advancing Alan Turing's research and also looking at the possibilities of creating so-called chatbots which would fluently communicate with humans through synthetic language. So with 2 large washers placed bug-like at the top corner of a roughly hewn face, a mouth suggested by the cable input, and hands placed together as if in prayer, Freddy, for me, is a very powerful object. This anthropomorphizing of the robot seems on one level a mere afterthought, but on the other, a reminder that we will always seek recognition in anything that speaks back or even looks in our direction, be it computer or human. And I went on to produce several collage pieces inspired by this robot, thinking about anthropometicism and its function allowing us to accept machine life. And this is a GIF, unfortunately this won't play. Oh, it will. And talking, thinking as well about sort of objects and pieces taking different forms. So this work was shown on the digital screen actually as part of the Joy of GIF project that Daniel wrote for, and then appeared as a print and on the internet in lots of different kind of, on lots of different scales. And I thought that was very interesting. Andrew's comments about scale in relation to how work can be read and received in different ways. So, the importance and function of the eyes and the features is something that has always troubled roboticists working with anthropomimetic projects. And most recently, it's been resolved, for example, by producing robots that do now assume the appearance of toys. And this is a piece that actually I showed quite near here in Compton Verney not so long ago in a great exhibition that was put together by Marina Warner called Only Make Believe. And it was an exhibition that was made up of historical objects of play plus artist work, and there's some great essays. I don't know, you may have that publication in the library here since it was so local. So the shoe doll was inspired by an object in what is called the Lovat collection at the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh. The Lovat collection is made up of a series of so-called emergent or emergency dolls collected mainly from the East End of London at the beginning of the 20th century. And this doll has been on permanent display at the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh since I was a child, and it's a popular object in the collection, and I've always found it very kind of strange, disquieting object. And somebody writing about this object described it as coming from the prehistory of the robot. And dolls in this collection were made from strange things: shoes, boots, bones, wooden spoons and scraps which might otherwise have been thrown away. And there was real echoes of that kind of real strange kind of sort of Dadaist kind of brute sort of aesthetic. Often when I went to robotic labs as well, you'd find that there was a strange kind of sort of mismatch. Sort of roboticists would be working on fairly sort of sophisticated sort of projects in terms of the research goals, but the actual visual experience of them was just really lagging behind, and nowhere was this more true than with this PeopleBot, which was one of the research projects at University of Hertfordshire. So I thought these kind of sort of these sort of mismatches were interesting, and it was very different in MIT, where the objects were highly polished and highly anthropomorphized, doing away in the most part, of course, with any residue of the uncanny that the other objects might have had. So the materials may differ, but the impulse remains the same. And I'm going to finish in this image, and I want to just go back to my opening thoughts. Given that the Heimlich is often characterised as something unexpected and familiar, something which, when juxtaposed with the everyday, creates feelings of unfamiliarity, it seems likely that with simulation now truly embedded in our culture, it must be to simulation that we increasingly look to provide us with these new uncanny encounters. It's a feeling which, by its very nature, is often evoked by something utterly unexpected. And I think sometimes that feeling can be found in art. More often, however, it's something that, as the etymology of the word suggests, actually comes out of something very ordinary, something which, when it turns its face, suddenly becomes utterly strange. And that's what I think has happened to photography in the face of the algorithm. Photography as a medium has become utterly unknowable again, perhaps as it originally appeared at its birth, and there is therefore no way of knowing where we'll go from here or how the image will turn. Thank you.